Welcome to the Policy Room. When Americans talk about foreign policy today, the most common reaction is simple. People feel the country has spent a very long time dealing with problems far away from home. After 2 decades of war, many viewers genuinely wonder why the United States remains connected to the Middle East at all. Tonight, we're not debating emotions, we're examining strategy. I'm Daniel Carter, and our goal is clarity rather than argument.
Thank you, Daniel. I'm Dr. Michael Harrington, a Washington-based senior fellow specializing in U.S. energy security and Middle East strategic policy. My work focuses on how American economic stability and international security commitments intersect. This topic matters because the public discussion often assumes U.S. involvement is optional, while policymakers tend to see it as structural. I'm glad we can slow the conversation down and unpack why the question keeps returning.
Dr. Harrington, let's start directly. Many Americans believe the Middle East was mainly about wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. Those conflicts ended or were reduced, and people ask a very practical question. If we are no longer fighting major ground wars, why does Washington still pay so much attention to the region?
Because the wars were never the central reason for involvement. They were events inside a larger strategic relationship. U.S. policy toward the Middle East existed long before those wars and continued after them. The region affects global economic stability, alliance credibility, and risk management. So even when military operations decline, strategic interest does not disappear. The public often links policy to wars, but policymakers link policy to systems.
So you're saying the wars were visible, but the deeper logic was less visible. Many viewers would respond, if Americans are tired and the country wants to focus domestically, shouldn't strategy adjust to public sentiment?
Public sentiment matters in democracies, but geography and global systems do not change because voters feel fatigue. Leaders still have to consider what happens if the United States disengages completely. Policymakers worry less about winning influence and more about preventing instability that could eventually affect Americans indirectly through prices, security threats, and alliance credibility.
Let's pause on that idea. A lot of people hear indirect effects and think it sounds abstract. They say, I live in Ohio or Texas or New Jersey. What does a political crisis in the Middle East actually do to my daily life?
It affects your cost of living and national security environment. Even when Americans don't notice immediately, global disruptions influence inflation, transportation costs, and economic confidence. Markets react to instability quickly. The United States has a large domestic economy, but it still operates inside a global system. That system is sensitive to certain regions, and the Middle East remains one of the most sensitive.
This brings us to the public perception problem. Many citizens think involvement means active intervention. They imagine troops, wars, and nation-building. Is that how policymakers define involvement?
No. Policymakers often mean presence, relationships, and risk management rather than constant military operations. Engagement can involve diplomacy, intelligence cooperation, deterrence, and maintaining partnerships. The public equates involvement with war because wars are visible. Quiet deterrence rarely appears in headlines.
There's also a generational factor. Younger Americans grew up during long conflicts and associate the Middle East with instability. They naturally ask why the U.S. doesn't simply step back and allow regional powers to manage their own issues.
That is understandable, but great powers rarely ignore strategically central regions. If a region influences trade flows, security risks, and alliances, absence itself becomes a policy choice with consequences. Policymakers ask, who fills the gap? And what happens if actors with different interests shape outcomes?
So the question changes from why are we there to what happens if we aren't.
Exactly. Strategy is comparative, not emotional. Leaders compare outcomes, not intentions. Withdrawal can create new risks that are more costly than limited engagement.
Before we go deeper, I want to clarify something. Many viewers believe the entire issue is about resources. No, they assume American interest exists only because of energy. Is that still the right way to understand it?
Energy was historically central, but today the explanation is broader. The region connects multiple global systems at once: economic, military, and diplomatic. Even as the energy picture changes, the structural importance remains. Understanding that requires us to step back from recent history and look at the region itself.
So before discussing policy decisions, we need to understand why the location matters in the first place.
Yes, the logic begins not with politics, but with geography.
We said at the end of our last discussion that before policy, we have to understand geography. Many Americans hear Middle East as a political idea, almost like a headline category. But you're suggesting the importance begins with the map itself, not ideology, not governments, and not even specific conflicts. So let me start very simply. Why does location matter so much in international strategy?
Because geography is permanent. Governments change, alliances shift, and economies rise or fall, but physical position stays the same. The Middle East sits at the intersection of three continents: Europe, Asia, and Africa. That makes it a natural corridor for movement of goods, energy, military forces, and communication routes. Any country trying to maintain global stability must pay attention to crossroads regions.
So in strategic thinking, the Middle East is less a single political unit and more a junction point.
Exactly. Policymakers often describe it as a bridge region. Ships moving between major economic centers pass nearby. Air routes connect through it. Digital cables cross under surrounding waters. This means disturbances there can ripple outward quickly. Even countries far away can feel consequences because the region links major markets together.
Let's make that concrete. When people think of global trade, they imagine massive container ships crossing oceans. How specifically does this region affect those movements?
Several narrow waterways are nearby. These are called choke points. A choke point is a passage so narrow that traffic cannot easily reroute. If disruption happens there, shipping slows or stops. Insurance costs rise, delivery times expand, and prices increase. Because modern economies depend on just-in-time delivery, even short disruptions create noticeable global effects.
So this is not theoretical. You're saying the supply chain Americans rely on electronics, consumer goods, manufacturing components, depends partly on stability around these routes.
Yes, the United States imports and exports through a global network. Even if a product never physically travels through the Middle East, its price can still change because global shipping capacity and energy transport are interconnected. Markets respond to risk. When uncertainty rises in a critical corridor, costs spread worldwide.
I want to emphasize something for viewers. Often policy debates treat distant regions as optional concerns. But if the physical system of trade depends on certain passages, ignoring them becomes difficult. Is that how strategic planners think?
Very much so. Strategy is partly about preventing concentration risk. When large portions of global trade pass near a small number of passages, stability becomes a shared interest. The United States historically positioned itself as a guarantor of open navigation. That role developed because the global economy depends on reliable movement.
And this connects to military presence, correct? Not necessarily for war, but for predictability.
Correct. Military presence often functions as reassurance and deterrence rather than combat. If shipping companies believe routes are protected and monitored, they continue operating normally. If uncertainty grows, companies react immediately. Policy planners aim to avoid panic reactions in markets.
There's also aviation. Most people don't think about flight paths strategically. Does geography affect that as well?
Yes, long-distance air travel often crosses the region because it sits between major population centers. Passenger flights and cargo flights use air corridors that depend on stable airspace management. Disruptions can lengthen routes and increase fuel consumption, which eventually affects ticket prices and shipping costs.
So geography connects directly to everyday economic experience. But some viewers may ask, other crossroads exist in the world. Why does this one receive more attention than others?
Because multiple systems overlap there simultaneously. Energy transport, maritime trade, aviation, and regional security all intersect. Few regions combine all those elements at once. When risks overlap, strategic attention increases. Policymakers focus where a single disturbance can affect several global systems at the same time.
That helps explain why the region repeatedly returns to American policy discussions even after specific conflicts end. It isn't memory, it's structural importance.
Yes, policymakers may disagree about tactics, but they rarely disagree about relevance. The map keeps drawing attention back.
Another interesting point is psychological distance. Americans often feel geographically protected by oceans. Does that perception influence public understanding?
It does. The United States enjoys natural security advantages, but globalization compresses distance. Economic and technological interdependence means events abroad transmit faster than in the past. Strategic planners operate on a global timeline, not a local one. Geography abroad still matters domestically.
So when Americans ask why Washington follows developments there closely, the answer begins with structural vulnerability rather than political preference.
That's a fair way to put it. The question is not whether the United States wants to care, but whether it can afford not to monitor a region that connects multiple international systems.
We focused on location and movement, but historically, the region became especially important for another reason. Geography created importance, yet something else made it central to modern economic life.
Yes, geography established relevance, but energy resources dramatically increased its strategic weight. To understand modern policy, we need to look at how energy transformed that geographic importance into a global priority.
Last time we established that geography made the region important. But geography alone doesn't explain the intensity of American involvement during the 20th century. Something clearly elevated the Middle East from a crossroads into a central strategic priority. I think most viewers suspect the answer is oil, but they may not understand exactly why it mattered so much.
You're right. Oil didn't just add importance, it transformed global power structures. In the early industrial period, coal powered economies, but by the mid-20th century, modern militaries, transportation, and manufacturing increasingly depended on petroleum. Oil became the fuel of mobility. Whoever had reliable access to it could sustain economic growth and military capability.
So this wasn't only about cars and consumer life. It was also about national survival during a major war environment.
Exactly. During World War II, leaders realized mechanized warfare required vast fuel supplies. Tanks, aircraft, and naval fleets depended on petroleum. After the war, policymakers concluded that stable oil supply was directly linked to national security. Economic growth also depended on cheap energy, so access became a long-term strategic objective.
And the Middle East contained large reserves that were relatively accessible compared to other regions at the time.
Yes, the combination of scale and extraction cost mattered. The region's oil fields were large and, historically, less expensive to produce. That meant global markets increasingly relied on them. As Europe and Japan rebuilt after World War II, their industries required energy imports. The United States recognized that its allies' recovery depended partly on stable energy flows from that area.
So American policy wasn't only about domestic supply, but about rebuilding partner economies.
Correct. After the war, the United States helped shape a system of international trade and finance. Strong allies strengthened political stability. But those allies lacked sufficient energy resources. If energy supply became unstable, their economies could weaken, and that would affect the broader global order Washington was trying to build.
This connects to something many people hear, but don't fully understand: the link between oil and inflation. Why did energy supply influence the American economy so strongly?
Energy is a foundational input. Transportation, manufacturing, agriculture, and heating depend on it. When oil prices rise sharply, production costs increase across sectors. Companies pass costs to consumers. So sudden supply disruptions can produce economy-wide inflation. That is why policymakers watch energy markets carefully.
And that became especially visible during the oil shocks of the 1970s.
Yes, those shocks were a turning point in public awareness. Supply reductions led to fuel shortages and rapid price increases. Americans experienced lines at gas stations. The event demonstrated that distant geopolitical developments could directly affect domestic economic stability. From that moment, energy security became a permanent policy concern.
So energy security isn't simply about having oil, but about preventing sudden disruption.
Exactly. Markets can adjust to gradual change, but they react strongly to abrupt interruptions. Policymakers therefore tried to maintain predictable supply conditions. That didn't always mean controlling resources directly. Often it meant maintaining relationships, monitoring risks, and ensuring open transport routes.
I want to ask about the financial side. There is frequent mention of the global dollar system and oil trade. Without going too technical, how did energy markets connect to financial stability?
Oil is traded globally, and stable pricing systems support international commerce. When energy transactions operate predictably, currencies and trade flows remain more stable. During the late 20th century, the United States supported an international economic framework where trade settlement and financial markets were closely linked to energy commerce. Stability in energy markets reinforced stability in financial markets.
So oil wasn't just a commodity. It became part of the architecture of the global economic system.
That's a good description. Because energy affects transportation and production everywhere, its reliability underpins economic confidence. Investors, manufacturers, and consumers all respond to energy expectations. Policymakers therefore treated disruptions not only as market events, but as systemic risks.
This also explains why American policy continued even when the United States produced significant oil domestically. The concern wasn't purely domestic supply levels.
Yes. The U.S. economy was, and still is, integrated with global markets. If allies or trading partners faced energy crises, their economies slowed, and that eventually affected American exports, financial markets, and employment. So, policymakers viewed global energy stability as part of domestic economic stability.
I think this clarifies something important. Many Americans assumed involvement meant seeking control. But you're describing something closer to maintaining predictability.
That's right. While public debates often frame policy as intervention versus withdrawal, officials frequently think in terms of risk management. The objective was to prevent sudden disruptions that could trigger economic or political instability across multiple regions.
However, the modern audience might respond. Today, the United States produces much more of its own energy. Technology changed dramatically. So logically, interest should decline.
That assumption seems reasonable at first. But energy markets are global, not isolated. Even if a country increases production, prices still depend on international supply and demand. To understand current policy, we need to examine how energy independence changed expectations and why strategic attention did not disappear.
We've reached a point that confuses many viewers. The United States dramatically increased domestic energy production over the past decade. People heard the phrase energy independence, and naturally they assumed a simple conclusion. If America produces its own oil and gas, it no longer needs to worry about the Middle East. Why didn't policy follow that logic?
Because energy independence does not mean energy isolation. The United States can produce large amounts of energy, but it still operates within a global pricing system. Oil is traded internationally. When supply disruptions occur anywhere significant, prices respond everywhere. Domestic production helps resilience, but it does not disconnect the U.S. economy from global markets.
So even if oil pumped in Texas never physically comes from the Middle East, the price Americans pay can still be influenced by events there.
Exactly. Oil is a globally priced commodity. Traders and refiners buy and sell based on worldwide supply expectations. If a major exporting region faces instability, global supply risk rises. Markets anticipate shortages and prices increase. American producers benefit in some cases, but consumers in transportation sectors face higher costs.
This helps explain why American gasoline prices sometimes change even when domestic production remains stable. People often assume local supply should determine local prices.
That's a common assumption, but energy markets don't function like local agriculture. They function like a global financial market. Expectations matter as much as physical shipments. If investors believe supply may tighten, prices adjust immediately. The economic effect reaches households quickly.
So the phrase energy independence was interpreted by the public as strategic independence. But policymakers understood it differently.
Correct. Policymakers saw it as improved security margin, not freedom from global dynamics. It reduced vulnerability, but did not eliminate interconnectedness. They still had to consider global stability because American economic stability depends on predictable global energy pricing.
There's another factor. U.S. allies, Europe, and parts of Asia still rely heavily on imported energy. How does that influence Washington's decisions?
It matters greatly. The United States has long-term alliances with countries whose economies depend on reliable imports. If those partners experience energy crises, their economic performance declines. That weakens political stability and affects international cooperation. Supporting stability in supply is therefore part of supporting alliances.
So American involvement partly reflects responsibility toward partners rather than purely domestic need.
Yes, alliances function as networks. If one major partner faces sustained economic shock, the entire network feels strain. Policymakers therefore consider not only American consumption, but also allied vulnerability. Strategic relationships require some level of shared security management.
Some viewers might say, this sounds like the U.S. is acting as a manager of the global economy. Is that how officials view their role?
Not as a manager, but as a stabilizer. Since the mid-20th century, the United States has supported open trade systems and predictable markets. Stability encourages investment and growth. Sudden disruptions discourage both. The role developed gradually because American economic strength allowed it to provide reassurance and coordination.
And without that reassurance, uncertainty spreads quickly.
Yes, markets dislike uncertainty more than high prices. Predictable high costs can be planned for. Unpredictable supply disruptions cause panic behavior, hoarding, speculation, and financial volatility. Policymakers try to prevent panic conditions.
Let me challenge the argument a bit. If markets adjust over time, why not simply allow regional actors to handle their own stability while the United States adapts economically?
Adaptation takes time, and sudden disruptions can produce cascading effects before adjustment occurs. Economic contraction, political instability among partners, and security risks can develop faster than markets rebalance. Policymakers therefore prefer prevention over reaction.
So in strategic thinking, involvement is less about resource control and more about risk avoidance.
That's a fair summary. The objective is reducing the probability of severe global shocks. Even a country with strong domestic production benefits from a stable international system because trade, finance, and employment depend on it.
There is also a perception issue. Many Americans believed once the U.S. produced enough energy, military presence would end. Yet security cooperation remained. That suggests energy alone cannot explain policy.
Correct. Energy explains part of the interest, but security commitments form another layer. Over decades, the United States built relationships designed to deter conflict and reassure partners. Those commitments persist because credibility matters. If promises appear unreliable, partners may take risky actions to protect themselves.
Meaning they might seek their own military solutions.
Yes, including arms competition or independent security measures that increase instability. Continued engagement can actually reduce the likelihood of larger conflicts.
So the policy debate in Washington isn't really stay or leave. It's about how to maintain stability with fewer direct interventions.
Exactly. The strategy evolved toward partnerships, coordination, and deterrence rather than large-scale ground wars.
And that naturally brings us to the next major element of this conversation. Beyond economics and markets, American policy also reflects formal commitments to specific partners.
Yes, to fully understand the reasoning, we need to examine how alliances and security guarantees influence decision-making and long-term presence.
We've talked about geography and energy, but now we arrive at something many viewers find harder to understand: alliances. Americans often hear that the United States has security partners in the Middle East, yet they aren't always sure what that actually means. When policymakers say security commitment, what are they promising?
A security commitment is essentially a pledge that the United States will help defend a partner against major external threats. It does not always mean automatic war, but it signals that the partner will not stand alone. The goal is deterrence. If potential aggressors believe a strong country might respond, they are less likely to initiate conflict in the first place.
So the objective is to prevent war rather than prepare for it.
Exactly. Deterrence works by shaping expectations. When adversaries calculate risk, they consider possible responses. If they anticipate international involvement, they may decide the cost outweighs any gain. The presence of a credible commitment can therefore stop a conflict before it begins.
Many Americans ask a practical question: why make such promises to countries far away? Why is credibility abroad considered important for security at home?
Because alliances function as signals across the entire international system. If the United States fails to uphold commitments in one region, partners in other regions may question reliability. That uncertainty can encourage arms buildups, independent defense strategies, or even nuclear programs. Credibility reduces incentives for risky behavior.
So a decision in one location can influence decisions globally.
Yes, international politics is interconnected. Allies watch how commitments are honored. They interpret consistency as stability. If they believe security guarantees are dependable, they cooperate more closely and avoid drastic self-protection measures.
That raises another issue. Some critics argue that alliances pull the United States into conflicts it would otherwise avoid. How do policymakers respond to that concern?
They argue the opposite can also be true. Without alliances, smaller states may act unpredictably because they feel vulnerable. Security guarantees give them confidence to avoid escalation, so while alliances carry obligations, they can also restrain partners and prevent crises from expanding.
In other words, reassurance can sometimes be stabilizing rather than entangling.
Correct. A country that feels protected is less likely to take desperate actions. Policymakers believe engagement provides influence. Influence allows communication and crisis management. Absence reduces both.
Let's talk about military presence. When Americans hear about bases or troops abroad, they often assume preparation for combat. Is the purpose primarily operational?
Operational capability is one function, but presence also communicates commitment. Small deployments can serve as tripwires. They demonstrate that an attack would involve more than a local confrontation. That discourages aggression and reassures partners simultaneously.
So even a limited presence changes calculations for potential attackers.
Yes, deterrence relies on perception. If adversaries believe the United States is likely to respond, they reconsider initiating conflict. The goal is not to fight wars, but to make wars unattractive options.
Another concern viewers raise involves cost. People ask whether maintaining partnerships and deployments drains domestic resources that could be spent internally.
Cost is always debated, but policymakers compare it to the cost of instability. A regional war, disrupted trade, or global recession could be far more expensive. The argument is that preventive presence can be cheaper than reactive intervention after a crisis spreads.
This also explains long-term relationships with regional governments. even when domestic politics within those countries differ from American norms. The partnership is strategic rather than ideological.
Yes, while values matter, security planning often prioritizes stability and predictability. Policymakers try to balance principles with practical risk reduction. Perfect alignment is rare in international relations.
There's also a communication dimension. Having established relationships means officials can coordinate quickly during emergencies.
Exactly. Crisis management depends on established channels. If leaders already trust each other and communicate regularly, misunderstandings are less likely to escalate into confrontation. Alliances therefore function as diplomatic infrastructure.
So the system works partly like insurance. Ideally, you never need to use it, but its existence changes behavior.
That's a useful analogy. Insurance reduces risk perception. Deterrence reduces conflict probability. Both rely on credibility and expectation.
But some Americans still wonder whether regional countries could eventually manage their own security without external involvement.
That is an ongoing policy debate. Gradual regional responsibility is a long-term goal, but sudden withdrawal can create power competition. Policymakers worry that rapid changes could encourage rivalries rather than cooperation.
Which leads to a broader issue. Even with alliances, the region has experienced repeated instability. Conflicts inside states and across borders still occur.
Yes, and that instability is precisely why alliances persist. The presence of internal conflict can spill outward. Understanding those spillover effects is essential to understanding continued U.S. attention.
So, to grasp the full picture, we need to look beyond formal agreements and examine how regional instability affects the wider world.
Exactly. The next step is understanding how local conflicts can produce international consequences far beyond the immediate battlefield.
We've explained alliances and deterrence, but viewers often notice something puzzling. Even when countries sign agreements and maintain partnerships, the Middle East still experiences internal conflicts. Many Americans ask, if these wars are local civil wars, why do they matter internationally?
Because internal conflicts rarely stay contained. Modern communication, migration, and economic links allow local instability to cross borders quickly. A civil war can produce refugees, economic disruption, and security risks that extend into neighboring states and sometimes far beyond the region.
The refugee issue is one people hear about often. At first glance, that seems like a humanitarian concern rather than a strategic one. Why do policymakers treat it as both?
Humanitarian and strategic issues overlap. Large refugee movements strain neighboring countries' economies, public services, and political stability. When neighboring states destabilize, regional security deteriorates. That instability can affect allies, trade partners, and international organizations. So humanitarian crises often evolve into strategic challenges.
So a conflict inside one country can create pressure on several surrounding governments.
Yes, schools, housing systems, and labor markets suddenly face massive demand. Political tensions rise as governments struggle to respond. In some cases, domestic politics becomes polarized, which complicates diplomatic cooperation with other nations.
And that eventually reaches Europe, which is a major U.S. partner.
Correct. If instability spreads toward allied regions, the United States becomes indirectly affected. Economic cooperation, security coordination, and trade relations depend on stable partners. Policymakers therefore monitor regional crises early to prevent broader consequences.
Another term people hear is terrorism. After the early 2000s, that word shaped American foreign policy heavily. How does regional instability connect to that threat?
Ungoverned or weakly governed areas can allow extremist groups to organize. When governments lose territorial control, armed groups sometimes fill the vacuum. Those groups may operate locally at first, but communication technology enables them to recruit internationally and plan attacks beyond their immediate environment.
So the concern is not only about territory, but about planning capability.
Exactly. Security planners worry about safe havens, areas where groups can train, coordinate, and spread ideology without interference. Preventing those environments from forming is easier than responding after networks become established.
Many Americans remember that the United States tried large-scale interventions, partly to eliminate such safe havens. But policy has changed. Why?
Because experience showed that massive military operations can be costly and complex. Policymakers shifted toward prevention, intelligence sharing, and cooperation with regional partners rather than long-term occupation. The goal became managing risks rather than transforming societies.
So instability still matters, but the method of response evolved.
Yes, the objective is early containment and coordination. Local governments often understand conditions better. Supporting their capacity can reduce escalation without large external deployments.
There's also an economic dimension. Conflicts disrupt production and trade inside the region. Does that significantly affect global markets?
It can. When infrastructure is damaged or transportation routes become unsafe, trade slows. Energy production, agriculture, and manufacturing decline. International investors withdraw due to uncertainty. That affects global supply and financial confidence, which can influence markets worldwide.
In other words, instability doesn't remain isolated because modern economies are interconnected.
Precisely. Economic networks transmit shocks rapidly. Even sectors unrelated to the conflict may react due to uncertainty and risk perception.
I want to return briefly to public perception. Some people argue that distance should shield the United States from regional turmoil. Does globalization weaken that protection?
Very much so. Information, travel, and financial flows move faster than ever. Events abroad can influence domestic conditions within days. Strategic planning must therefore anticipate distant disruptions rather than react after consequences appear at home.
So policymakers monitor instability not out of curiosity, but out of preventive planning.
Correct. Early awareness allows diplomatic and economic tools to be used before crises expand. Prevention is generally less costly than emergency response.
And yet there is another layer that raises stakes even further. When internal conflict exists in a region where advanced weapons could appear, the risk becomes more serious.
Yes, when instability intersects with the possibility of nuclear capability, policymakers become particularly concerned. The consequences of miscalculation would be far greater than economic disruption.
Which brings us to the next part of the discussion. To understand long-term U.S. attention, we also have to consider the risk of nuclear proliferation and why preventing it is such a central objective.
Exactly. The possibility of additional nuclear actors changes strategic calculations dramatically and influences diplomatic engagement in the region.
We've now reached an issue that often appears in headlines but is rarely explained calmly: nuclear proliferation. Many viewers hear the term and immediately think it simply means a country building a nuclear weapon. But policymakers seem to treat it as a much broader strategic concern. What does proliferation actually mean in practical terms?
Proliferation refers to the spread of nuclear weapons capability to additional states. The concern is not only the weapon itself, but the chain reaction it can trigger. When one country gains such a capability, neighbors may feel vulnerable and pursue their own programs. That can create a regional arms competition with extremely high risks.
So the danger is cumulative rather than isolated.
Exactly. Nuclear strategy relies on deterrence, the idea that two nuclear-armed states avoid war because the cost would be catastrophic. But deterrence becomes less predictable when more actors enter the system, especially in regions with existing tensions or unresolved disputes.
Why is the Middle East considered particularly sensitive in this regard?
Because several rivalries exist simultaneously: political competition, territorial disputes, and security fears overlap. If multiple states in such an environment possessed nuclear weapons, misinterpretations during crises could escalate rapidly. Policymakers worry about short decision times and high mistrust.
Short decision times meaning leaders may feel pressured to act quickly before confirming information.
Correct. In tense environments, warning systems may be less robust and communication channels weaker. A false alarm or misread signal could trigger retaliation. Preventing additional nuclear programs reduces the chance of such dangerous scenarios.
Some viewers ask, if nuclear weapons deter large wars elsewhere, why not allow the same logic to apply here?
Deterrence works best with stable communication, clear command structures, and established rules. Regions with frequent crises and multiple rivalries increase the risk of accidents or unauthorized actions. Policymakers therefore prioritize preventing proliferation rather than managing it after expansion.
This explains why diplomacy around nuclear agreements receives so much attention in Washington.
Yes, negotiations, inspections, and monitoring systems aim to limit capability development and build transparency. The objective is to create predictability. Even partial verification reduces uncertainty and helps prevent rapid escalation.
Another concern sometimes mentioned is non-state actors. How does that factor into nuclear policy?
If nuclear materials exist in unstable environments, there is concern about security of those materials. Governments with strong institutions typically maintain strict control, but instability increases risk. Preventing proliferation reduces the number of sites requiring constant protection and monitoring.
So the focus is risk management, again, minimizing worst-case scenarios.
Exactly. Policymakers evaluate probability and consequence. Even a low-probability nuclear incident has such severe consequences that prevention becomes a priority. That shapes diplomatic engagement, sanctions policy, and security cooperation.
There's also an alliance dimension. If partners doubt protection, they might seek their own nuclear deterrent.
Yes, security assurances from the United States are partly intended to discourage allies from developing independent nuclear programs. If allies trust extended deterrence, they have less incentive to pursue their own weapons. That helps limit global proliferation.
So involvement in the region partly prevents expansion of nuclear states beyond the region as well.
Correct. Proliferation rarely stays local. Once one region experiences expansion, other regions may reconsider their policies. Preventing it in one area supports the broader non-proliferation system.
I want to clarify tone here. Policymakers aren't assuming conflict is inevitable. They're trying to ensure crises never reach catastrophic levels.
That's right. The goal is stability, not confrontation. Diplomatic engagement, monitoring agreements, and communication channels exist to avoid miscalculation. Even countries with disagreements often maintain dialogue for this reason.
Yet in recent years, another factor has increased attention to the region. It isn't only local actors or nuclear risk anymore. Larger global competitors are becoming more active.
Yes, major powers outside the region have expanded their economic and military involvement. That introduces a different strategic layer because regional stability now intersects with global competition.
So the conversation shifts from regional security to great power strategy.
Exactly. To fully understand continued U.S. engagement, we need to examine how rival powers view the region and why their presence influences American decisions moving forward.
Up to this point, we've discussed the Middle East as if it were mainly a regional issue affecting local states and American interests. But increasingly, analysts describe it as part of a larger global competition. Viewers often hear that China and Russia are becoming more active there. What does that actually mean in strategic terms?
It means the region is no longer only about local stability. It has become a space where major powers test influence, build partnerships, and secure economic access. China and Russia approach the region differently from the United States, but both see opportunity. When multiple major powers engage the same region, it becomes part of global strategic balance.
Let's start with China. Many Americans associate China primarily with trade and manufacturing. Why would China care about the Middle East?
China's economy depends heavily on global trade routes and imported energy. The Middle East sits along key maritime corridors and remains a major energy supplier to Asian economies. Beijing seeks long-term reliability. It invests in infrastructure, ports, and economic partnerships to reduce uncertainty and guarantee steady access to resources and transportation pathways.
So China's involvement is largely economic rather than military.
Mostly economic, though economic influence can produce strategic leverage. Infrastructure investments create relationships. Those relationships often translate into diplomatic cooperation. Over time, economic presence can shape regional decision-making even without large military deployments.
In other words, influence doesn't always require bases or troops.
Correct. Influence can come from financing, trade, and technology cooperation. Countries may align policies with partners who provide investment and economic opportunity. Strategic competition today often involves connectivity rather than occupation.
Now let's consider Russia. Its approach appears different.
Yes, Russia emphasizes military presence and political mediation. It positions itself as a security partner and diplomatic broker in regional conflicts. By maintaining relationships with multiple sides, Moscow increases its diplomatic relevance and demonstrates global reach beyond its immediate neighborhood.
So Russia's objective is partly status, demonstrating it remains a global power.
That's part of it. Visibility matters in international politics. Active involvement in a strategically important region signals capability and influence. It also allows Russia to negotiate with other powers from a stronger position.
Where does that leave the United States? If other major powers expand their presence, what concerns policymakers in Washington?
They worry about loss of influence and reduced ability to shape outcomes. If rivals become primary partners for regional governments, American diplomatic leverage declines. That could affect security cooperation, intelligence sharing, and economic coordination across a wider international network.
So the issue isn't territorial control, but strategic positioning.
Exactly. Modern competition rarely involves direct confrontation. It involves access, relationships, and credibility. Maintaining engagement helps the United States remain a relevant participant in regional decisions that have global consequences.
Some viewers may ask whether this risks turning the region into a battleground between major powers.
Policymakers try to avoid that. The objective is balance rather than confrontation. Continued presence can actually discourage rivalry from escalating because communication channels remain open and expectations stay clear.
There is also a technology dimension: telecommunications, infrastructure systems, and data networks. Do those play a role?
Yes, digital infrastructure influences economic and security relationships. Countries that provide technology platforms can shape standards and long-term partnerships. That affects intelligence cooperation, cybersecurity, and commercial integration. Competition increasingly occurs in these areas rather than conventional military arenas.
So the region connects global competition, not just regional politics.
Correct. The Middle East now sits at the intersection of energy markets, trade routes, and great power relationships. Decisions there can affect broader international alignment patterns.
From a viewer's perspective, this reframes the question. It's not simply why the U.S. remains involved, but what absence might allow others to shape.
Yes, policymakers often think in terms of presence versus vacuum. If a major actor withdraws completely, others fill the gap. That changes the balance of cooperation and influence worldwide.
And that balance ties directly into global commerce, which ultimately affects domestic economic conditions.
Exactly. Strategic competition and economic stability are interconnected. To understand how these decisions influence daily life, we need to look specifically at global trade flows and transportation networks.
So our next step is examining trade routes themselves, not just where they are, but how they influence the global economy and American prosperity.
Right. Once we look at trade, the connection between distant geography and everyday economic experience becomes clearer.
We've now connected the region to major power competition. But I want to bring the conversation back to something very practical: trade. Many viewers understand trade in a general sense, yet they may not realize how physical transportation routes influence national policy. Why do shipping lanes matter so much to strategic planners?
Because global commerce depends on predictable movement. Modern economies rely on continuous flow of goods, raw materials, manufactured products, and energy supplies. Shipping lanes are the highways of international trade. If a major route becomes unsafe or uncertain, delays occur, insurance costs rise, and prices increase worldwide.
So when policymakers discuss protecting navigation, they're not talking abstractly. They're talking about the everyday functioning of the global economy.
Exactly. Supermarkets, factories, and technology companies all depend on timely deliveries. Even small disruptions can cascade through supply chains. Businesses plan inventory carefully. When shipments slow, production schedules change, and costs expand quickly.
Let's walk through a simple example. Suppose a shipping route near the Middle East becomes unstable for a few weeks. What happens first?
Shipping companies reroute vessels or pause departures. Rerouting increases travel distance and fuel consumption. Insurance companies raise premiums because risk increases. Those additional expenses raise shipping prices. Importers then pay more to receive goods, and eventually consumers see higher retail prices.
So a distant disruption can appear in a domestic store shelf price.
Yes, globalization links markets closely. Even goods not produced in the region can be affected because shipping capacity is shared worldwide. When one corridor slows, congestion develops elsewhere.
We often hear the phrase supply chain. During recent years, it became a common topic. Is this the type of vulnerability policymakers are trying to avoid?
Correct. Supply chains depend on reliability. Businesses can handle gradual change, but sudden uncertainty causes shortages and panic buying. Policymakers aim to prevent situations where transportation routes become unpredictable for extended periods.
And energy shipments also move through these routes.
Yes, a large share of global energy transport passes through nearby waterways. If shipments slow, energy markets react immediately. Even countries not directly importing from the region still experience price fluctuations because markets are integrated.
So protecting trade routes is partly protecting economic confidence.
That's a good way to describe it. Confidence keeps investment stable. Investors and businesses make long-term plans based on expectations of reliable transportation. If confidence weakens, companies delay decisions and economic growth slows.
Another dimension is insurance. You mentioned premiums increasing. People may not realize how important insurance markets are to trade.
They are essential. Ships require coverage before entering high-risk areas. If insurers judge a region unsafe, some vessels may avoid it entirely. That reduces available shipping capacity. Less capacity means higher costs and slower deliveries globally.
So security presence can indirectly keep insurance rates manageable.
Yes, stability reassures insurers and shipping companies. Predictability allows commerce to continue smoothly. The objective is not control of trade, but preservation of open access.
There's also the American export side. The U.S. sells agricultural products, energy, and manufactured goods abroad. Do these routes affect American producers as well?
Absolutely. Exporters rely on stable transportation to reach international customers. If routes become unreliable, American goods may arrive late or cost more to deliver, making them less competitive. That affects employment and economic activity domestically.
So involvement isn't only about imports or prices. It also supports American businesses selling overseas.
Correct. Trade works both directions. Open routes allow American companies to participate in global markets. Strategic planners therefore consider both consumer and producer interests.
When people ask why a distant region influences American policy, this seems like one of the clearest answers. Trade networks connect economies in ways that geography alone might not reveal to the public.
Yes, modern prosperity depends on international exchange. Protecting predictable exchange reduces economic volatility and supports long-term growth.
But this raises a difficult question. If these routes are so important, what would happen if the United States simply withdrew from active engagement in the region?
That scenario worries policymakers. They believe uncertainty would increase quickly. Other powers or local rivalries could shape conditions, and markets would react before any new balance formed.
So the debate becomes less about presence and more about consequences of absence.
Exactly. To evaluate policy choices, we have to examine what a full withdrawal might realistically produce, both regionally and globally.
We've now explained why the region matters, but this is where the public question becomes very direct. Many Americans say if involvement is complicated and costly, why not simply leave and let regional countries handle their own affairs? What do policymakers actually think would happen if the United States withdrew completely?
They worry about a power vacuum. A power vacuum means no single stabilizing influence exists, so multiple actors compete to shape the environment. That competition can produce uncertainty, miscalculation, and rapid escalation. Markets and governments respond to uncertainty quickly, often before new arrangements form.
So withdrawal would not produce a quiet adjustment period.
Probably not. When a long-standing security presence disappears suddenly, regional players reassess their security assumptions. Some might increase military spending, others might form new rivalries, and still others might seek stronger protection from outside powers.
That last point is important. If the United States left, it doesn't mean the region becomes inactive. It means other major powers could increase their involvement.
Exactly. Strategic spaces rarely remain empty. Rival powers might expand economic or military roles. That shift could change alliances and diplomatic influence globally, not just locally.
Let's focus on regional dynamics first. Without a stabilizing presence, would countries feel less secure?
Yes, security guarantees reduce uncertainty. If those guarantees disappear quickly, states may assume they must rely on themselves. That often leads to arms buildups, missile development, and defensive posturing. Unfortunately, defensive actions by one state can appear offensive to another, increasing tensions.
So even if no one intends aggression, fear can still produce conflict.
Correct. International politics often involves perception. A government strengthening defenses may be interpreted as preparation for attack. Misinterpretation is one of the most common causes of escalation.
There's also the economic reaction. What would financial markets do if a sudden withdrawal occurred?
Financial markets would likely react immediately. Investors respond to uncertainty. Energy prices might spike, insurance costs could rise, and stock markets could become volatile. Even rumors of instability can produce economic ripple effects long before actual shortages occur.
So the consequences would reach ordinary Americans through economic channels fairly quickly.
Yes, higher transportation costs, increased inflation pressure, and reduced investment confidence could follow. Policymakers consider these second-order effects carefully.
Another issue you mentioned earlier is alliances. How would partners interpret a sudden departure?
They might question long-term commitments elsewhere. Allies depend on predictability. If they believe support can disappear quickly, they may change defense strategies. Some could seek independent deterrence capabilities, including advanced weapons programs.
Which could actually make the world more dangerous rather than less.
That is the concern. Withdrawal might reduce immediate obligations but increase long-term instability. Policymakers compare short-term relief with long-term risk.
Let's address a counterargument. Some analysts say regional actors should eventually take responsibility for their own stability. Is that unrealistic?
It's not unrealistic, but timing matters. Gradual transitions allow institutions and confidence to develop. Abrupt change forces rapid adaptation, and rapid adaptation often produces mistakes. Policymakers prefer gradual adjustment rather than sudden disengagement.
So the debate inside Washington is not about permanent presence versus total withdrawal, but about pace and method.
Exactly. Many officials support reducing direct military involvement while maintaining diplomatic and security partnerships. The objective is to lower risk without creating instability.
That sounds like a balancing act. Less intervention, but continued engagement.
Yes, policymakers call it burden sharing and regional capacity building. Partners gradually assume greater roles while coordination continues.
And if that approach works, the United States can avoid large-scale wars while still preventing systemic shocks.
That's the intention. Stability does not require constant military action. It requires communication, deterrence, and cooperation.
So the real policy conversation isn't should America stay forever, but how should America remain involved differently?
Correct. Strategy evolves with circumstances. The focus is shifting toward diplomacy, intelligence cooperation, and limited deterrence rather than occupation or nation-building.
Which leads naturally to our next topic. If the method of engagement is changing, we should examine what the new American strategy actually looks like.
Yes, understanding the modern approach helps explain how policymakers hope to maintain stability while reducing direct military commitments.
We've described the risks of sudden withdrawal, but we've also said American strategy is changing. Many viewers still imagine U.S. involvement as large troop deployments and long wars. Yet policymakers now speak about a different approach. What does the modern strategy actually look like?
The modern strategy focuses on lighter presence and stronger partnerships. Instead of trying to directly manage events on the ground, the United States increasingly supports regional partners with training, intelligence sharing, and defensive systems. The aim is to help local governments maintain stability themselves while avoiding large-scale American combat operations.
So rather than direct control, the emphasis is coordination.
Exactly. Policymakers concluded that long occupations are costly and difficult to sustain politically. A cooperative model spreads responsibility. Regional partners provide local knowledge and presence, while the United States contributes technology, surveillance capability, and diplomatic coordination.
Let's talk about intelligence cooperation. People hear the term, but may not understand its importance.
Intelligence cooperation means sharing information about threats, movements, and potential conflicts. Early warning allows governments to respond before crises grow. For example, if officials identify an emerging militant group or escalating border tension, they can act preventively instead of reacting after violence expands.
So prevention replaces reaction.
That's the goal. Preventive measures are usually less costly and less visible. They rarely appear in headlines, but they reduce the probability of large conflicts. Quiet success often looks like nothing happening.
Another term often used is deterrence. How does deterrence work without large troop numbers?
Deterrence today often relies on capability rather than mass. Advanced defensive systems, air and naval patrols, and rapid response capacity signal that aggression would face consequences. The objective is credibility, not permanent occupation. A smaller but capable presence can still influence calculations.
Technology seems central to this approach.
Yes, surveillance satellites, early warning systems, and defensive missile technology allow monitoring without large deployments. Communication networks also help coordinate partners quickly. Modern strategy relies on information advantage rather than territorial control.
And diplomacy appears more active as well.
Diplomacy plays a major role. Officials invest time in mediation, negotiation, and confidence-building measures. Even countries with disagreements often maintain dialogue channels. Communication reduces misunderstandings and allows crisis de-escalation before confrontation becomes unavoidable.
So the new strategy is quieter, but still engaged.
That's a good description. The United States remains involved, but with a different posture, less direct intervention and more support, coordination, and deterrence.
How does this affect public perception? Many Americans equate engagement with war.
The challenge is visibility. Military operations are obvious. Diplomatic and intelligence activities are not. As a result, the public may think involvement has ended when it has actually changed form. The objective is stability without constant headlines.
There's also economic engagement, trade, technology partnerships, and development initiatives.
Yes, economic cooperation supports stability by creating incentives for peaceful relations. Countries connected through commerce have stronger reasons to avoid conflict. Policymakers view economic integration as a complement to security cooperation.
So instead of focusing only on preventing conflict, the strategy also encourages conditions that make conflict less attractive.
Exactly. Stability is stronger when states benefit from cooperation. Security, diplomacy, and economic ties reinforce each other.
Given all these changes, it sounds like U.S. policy is evolving rather than ending.
Correct. The goal is sustainable engagement, maintaining influence and stability while reducing direct military burden. It reflects lessons learned over decades.
And that leads us to a final, forward-looking question. If energy systems evolve and regional economies develop, will the Middle East remain as strategically important in the future?
That's the key long-term issue. To answer it, we need to consider how global energy transition and regional modernization might reshape the relationship between the United States and the Middle East.
We've covered history, geography, alliances, and strategy. So let's end with the forward-looking question many viewers are asking. The world is moving toward new energy technologies, new economic patterns, and possibly less dependence on traditional fuels. Does that mean the Middle East will eventually stop being important to the United States?
Its importance will change, but it will not disappear. Even if global energy demand shifts over time, geography does not change. The region will still sit between major economic centers and along key transportation corridors. Trade, communication cables, and aviation routes will continue passing through or near it.
So even in a lower carbon world, location alone keeps relevance.
Yes, energy transition reduces one layer of dependence, but it does not remove strategic connectivity. In fact, new technologies, data networks, advanced manufacturing inputs, and logistics infrastructure still require stable transit routes. Stability in crossroads regions remains valuable.
Let's talk specifically about energy transition. If renewable energy grows, wouldn't global markets become less sensitive to disruptions there?
Over decades, sensitivity may decrease, but the transition is gradual. Fossil fuels will remain part of the global energy mix for many years. Industries, aviation, and shipping cannot change overnight. During the transition period, markets may actually be more volatile because supply systems are adjusting while demand still exists.
So paradoxically, change can temporarily increase instability.
Exactly. When systems evolve, uncertainty rises before new patterns stabilize. Policymakers therefore remain attentive to regions that can affect supply reliability during that adjustment phase.
Another factor is economic development inside the region itself. Many Middle Eastern countries are diversifying beyond energy. Does that alter the relationship?
Yes. As economies diversify, partnerships expand beyond resource trade. Investment, technology cooperation, and infrastructure projects become more important. That creates broader diplomatic engagement rather than narrower energy-focused ties.
Meaning the relationship could become more economic and less military over time.
That is the expectation. Security cooperation may continue, but economic and technological collaboration will likely grow. Countries seek modernization and integration into global markets, and the United States remains a significant partner in those areas.
Where do great power dynamics fit into this future? We discussed China and Russia earlier.
They will remain part of the picture. As the region develops economically, competition for influence may shift from security to investment and technology standards. The United States will want to maintain partnerships to preserve access and cooperation in a changing global economy.
So the region may move from an energy battleground to a connectivity hub.
That's a useful way to describe it. Transportation, finance, digital infrastructure, and commerce could define its importance more than raw resources in the future.
For the American public, this leads to a clearer understanding. The question was never simply why the United States stayed after certain wars. It was why policymakers see ongoing relevance even as circumstances evolve.
Correct. Strategy follows structural factors, geography, networks, and stability. Specific policies may change, but those fundamentals remain influential.
If you had to summarize for viewers in one idea, what should they remember?
The United States does not stay engaged out of habit. It stays engaged because events in interconnected regions can influence economic stability, security risks, and global cooperation. The form of engagement evolves, but the interest persists.
So the future is not about permanent conflict, but continued connection.
Exactly. The relationship will likely become less military and more diplomatic and economic, but it will remain strategically relevant.
That brings us full circle. Understanding foreign policy requires looking beyond individual events and examining systems that shape long-term decisions.
And once those systems are visible, the persistence of attention becomes easier to understand.
Dr. Harrington, thank you for helping us clarify a topic that often feels confusing or emotional.
Thank you, Daniel. Conversations like this help bridge the gap between public perception and policy reasoning.
And to our viewers, thank you for joining us on the Policy Room. In our next discussion, we'll continue examining how global systems influence national decisions and what they mean for everyday life.